Let's make some round artisan sourdough bread. This is my sourdough starter. It is active and is ready to make bread out of. You can see the air bubbles on it. So I transferred the starter from the big bowl to the smaller bowl so I can measure out 1 cup of the sourdough starter. You can see I have a generous 1 cup, perfectly fine. So I'm just going to dump this 1 cup of sourdough starter back into this big bowl. Now we're going to pour in our 1 1/4 cup of water. We're just going to mix it around. This is a Dutch whisk or a Dutch dough hook. And I am just going to sprinkle some flour in here. Just going to whisk it up some. This is just regular all-purpose flour. Now I am sprinkling in 2 teaspoons of salt. I'm going to whisk that in, and we're going to whisk in some more flour. You can see the dough is starting to come together. It's getting thicker. It's starting to clean the bowl a little bit. Below, I will link a video on how I cared for this particular 1 cup of sourdough starter, how I went from keeping it stored in the fridge when not in use to getting it ready to make this bread. So again, I have that video linked below. Now you can see it's really starting to come together and clean the bowl even more. You can see I am turning the sourdough out onto my floured countertop. And the bowl's fairly clean. I'm sprinkling a little bit more flour on top. So now I am just using the bench scraper in my hand to fold the dough into the center and push it down just to help give it some shape and to prepare to form it. Now we're just kneading the sourdough. You can see when I was making this dough, I did not weigh out my sourdough starter, my flour, or my water. I don't do that. I follow the very same principles when I make sourdough bread as I do when making yeasted bread. If you don't know how to make homemade yeasted bread, I do have a video on how to do that. I give you step-by-step instructions as well as a free download that includes step-by-step pictures, directions, the recipe, and all the little tips and tricks and everything you need to know on how to make bread. So as far as making the sourdough bread, again, I use the same type of method. You do not want to have too much flour on your counter or your hands. Just add a little bit at a time as you need it. It's just to keep it from sticking to you and to the counter. The purpose of kneading and folding this dough is you are trying to create tension on the top surface of the dough. And by creating the tension, you are creating the shape so it does not fall flat. You want it to be nice and firm on the top. I test the surface of the dough for firmness and tension by letting it sit just for a second to make sure it keeps its shape, and then I gently poke on it. By poking or pushing on the dough, I am able to tell about the body of the dough. I can tell if it has enough body that'll hold its shape and it'll go ahead and rise. I just lightly oiled the pan and turned my dough into the pan top side down, flipping it over and just kind of shaking it around to help coat the sides of the dough as well. Now you can cover it with a lid if you want, but I prefer to use the plastic wrap. I like giving it a tight seal. And then I let mine sit overnight, and I like to use a Sharpie and to trace the dough ball, like right there, and then it just gives me a visual, and in the morning I can see how much the dough raised. So you can see this is the very next morning, and the dough has doubled, if not tripled in size. You can see all of these air pockets here. So this dough is ready for the next step. I do not have a proofing or banneton basket. I just use a plastic colander and a butter muslin cloth. Now, when you use a butter muslin cloth or any cloth like this, you want to flour it really, really well. So you'll see throughout this process, I just keep adding flour, and I really want that cloth to be very well coated in flour. While I'm doing that, I want to apologize for the video to be in portrait mode now. I guess I did not catch it, so I'm sorry, but don't worry, it'll go back to landscape mode in a little bit. So you want to make sure that when we put your cloth inside of the basket, that area that's going to be touching your bread is very much extra coated. And then you'll also want to coat with flour the rest of the butter muslin. We got the cloth back in the basket, and we're adding some more flour. Again, we floured our countertop. We are getting ready to turn out our dough back onto this floured countertop. You can see it has some active bubbles. Normally, I punch this down inside the bowl before I dump it out, but we will do that on the counter. See, the bowl is pretty clean. We're flouring our hands. I'm just kind of punching it down some. Again, the bench scraper. I love that bench scraper. And believe it or not, I got it from the Dollar Tree for just $1 several years ago, and it's all stainless steel. It is just, it's a wonderful bench scraper. Now you can see I am just pushing down and folding over the sourdough. You can see I floured the edges of my hands, and I push down and tuck in on the outside of the dough. I push down and tuck in towards the center on the underside. I'm trying to create tension on the surface of the dough, on the top part there. And I'm just spinning it around as I push down and tuck in. And that's just helping to create my tension. This process of doing it this way is just something I came up with. I know a lot of people do like the fold and stretch method. I've never done that. This has always worked for me. Now, after I shape my dough, I let it set like you just saw. Then I take my finger and I poke on the dough. I'm just judging the plumpness, the firmness of it, and it wasn't quite firm enough, so you can see I am folding the dough again. Okay, so now we're going to just give it a few more rounds. Now we're letting the dough sit. I'm just looking at the dough and making sure it holds its shape. And I'm going to press on it, and I want to feel firmness. I want to feel body to it. I felt body to it, so now we're going to carefully put this dough top side down into our floured basket. Now, here is where I completely forgot. Before I put it top side down, I always heavily flour the top to keep, just as extra flouring to keep it from sticking to the cloth. However, I was in a conversation with my daughter. She was heading out to work, and so we had a conversation going, and I completely forgot to flour the top. So I'm going to pay for this in a little bit. Okay, now just put the cloth part back on the top, and it's going to double in size whenever it's ready to go into the oven. But we're just going to go ahead and cover it up and put it to the side and wait a few hours until it has doubled in size. In the meantime, let's go ahead and clean up our mess. Is it just me, or is there something so calming and relaxing about being in the kitchen and making food for your family, especially food they go crazy for? I just find it so comforting. To bake my artisan sourdough round loaf, I am using a cast iron Dutch oven. It is actually too small for my sourdough loaf, but it's what I have and I make it work, and I will show you in a little bit how I make it work. So I preheat the oven to 475, and while the oven's preheating, the cast iron and the lid are both in the oven preheating as well. So I just pull them out. They are piping hot. Now I'm going to sprinkle some cornmeal in the bottom. This just helps to elevate the sourdough bread off of the bottom of the pan so it doesn't burn. I've never baked it without adding cornmeal to the bottom, so I don't know if it would actually burn or not. You can see our sourdough has doubled in size now. Now I am taking parchment paper, placing it over the top, and I'm going to spread my hand out as far as I can and gently but quickly dump the sourdough upside down onto the parchment. And now I am pulling the butter muslin off, and here is where I told you I will pay for it later by forgetting to flour the top of the dough before placing upside down in my colander, because you can see the very top point of the dough is sticking to the cloth. So if this happens to you, very carefully try to get it off. Now I actually successfully got it off without popping it too much. There was one time where I actually tore the top and my bread came out pretty flat. Now I am gently but quickly lifting the dough and placing it in the hot cast iron Dutch oven. And you can see how the dough kind of wrinkled up. That's because, like I said earlier, my Dutch oven is a little too small for this size of loaf, but we make it work. By making it work, I take a bamboo stick and I just push down on the parchment paper and try to make sure that it's in there, that the dough is in there all the way, touching the bottom, and just try to remove as many wrinkles as I can. Now here's my razor blade. This is just a typical box cutter razor blade and just a cardboard cutout that I made as a holder for it. Normally, once I get the dough into the Dutch oven, I go ahead and I will put a design or just cut a simple slit in the top of the dough. But because that cloth stuck to the top of the dough, I'm just going to let it go ahead and bust on its own and create a rustic type of loaf. The Dutch oven goes into the oven. You want to make sure the lid is on, and it's going to bake for 20 minutes at 475 degrees with the lid on. Here we are. It has already baked for 20 minutes. Now we are going to remove the lid and lower the temperature to 450 degrees and let it bake for another 20 minutes. The time is up. You want to immediately remove the bread from the Dutch oven and place it on a cooling rack right away. And the cornmeal in the Dutch oven, it literally just falls right out. It's not burnt on or anything. And here you can see that it just went ahead and did a rustic split. It smells delicious. It looks wonderful. I am going to insert some photos of some sourdoughs I have done in the past so you can see how each one can be unique. And all of this white on the sides, that is the flour. Now, if you don't like all the looks of that flour on, you can take a stiff bristled brush and remove that flour. Now, I let this sourdough cool for about 1 hour on the cooling rack before cutting into it. So now we are going to cut into it. And I take a serrated knife and just cut right through it. You can see the bottom, it's nice and crusty. Sourdough, the top and the bottom will be more hard and crunchy, but the inside will be soft and fluffy. Oh, did you just see that? She snagged that piece. I did not even notice that. So right here I am showing you the crust, okay, the outer ring of the sourdough. And that's just showing you that the perimeter will be nice and crunchy and the center will be soft and fluffy. You can never go wrong with butter. Especially on warm bread, butter is just delicious. If you would like to learn how to make your own homemade butter, I do have a video on that. I will link below as well. Enjoy!